negotiation and security. People aren't interested in that. We want the full facts. And I'm simply made some simple illegal points that show the full debate has not occurred. Yes, I will.
I'm very grateful.
We are going to leave the British House of Commons here and return here to Washington, to Capitol Hill, where the Senate Armed Services Committee is about to meet. They're holding a confirmation hearing on the nominees to lead U.S. military special operations and U.S. Central Command. Oklahoma Senator Jim Inhofe is the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Meeting will come to order. The committee meets today to consider the nominations of the General Frank McKenzie to be commander of the Central Command and Lieutenant General Richard Clark to be the commander of the Special Operations Command. Of course, we appreciate very much your many years of service, and we'll expect that when you are recognized for your opening statements that you recognize your family. That is a very important part of your being here today. We do have some required questions, and I'd ask you to answer these questions so that audibly, so we'll be able to hear your response. First one, have you adhered to the applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I will. I will.
All right. Do you agree when asked to give your personal views, even if those views differ from the administration in power?
I will.
Have you assumed any duties or undertaken any actions which would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
No, sir.
No.
Thank you. Prompting does help. Will you ensure your staff complies with deadlines established for requested communications, including questions for the record and hearings?
I will.
I will.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
I will.
Will those witnesses be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They
Yes,
will.
sir.
And do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify upon request before this committee?
I do.
I will.
And lastly, do you agree to provide documents, including copies of electronic forms of communications in a timely manner when requested by a duly constituted committee, or to consult with the committee regarding the basis of any good faith delay or denial in providing such documents?
I do.
I will.
Okay, well, thank you both for your decades of service to our country. We appreciate the great work that you have done. The committee recently held a hearing to discuss the findings of the National Defense Strategy Commission. Their report says the commission assesses unequivocally that the NDS is not adequately resourced. It's clear we must provide sufficient, sustainable, and predictable funding to make the NDS a reality. During the hearing, Ambassador Edelman highlighted the bipartisan conclusions reached by this commission. By the way, this commission report, have both of you read this commission report?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's one of the best reports in my years of experience I've heard and put together, and it tells a lot of the hard truths you don't like to talk about, what our condition is today, what we need to, how we need to improve it. General McKenzie, the NDS Commission, report noted that the National Defense Strategy talks are about accepting more risk in the Middle East, but was vague on where that risk might be taken, for example, in the fight against ISIS or containing Iran or in Afghanistan. Look forward to your views on what accepting more risk in the Middle East might look like. General Clark, if confirmed, you will be responsible for ensuring our Special Operations Forces are trained, equipped, and ready to implement the NDS and confront threats across the spectrum. So we appreciate your being here today. We are going to be interested particularly in your comments on our peer competition in both in the threats that we are faced today. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to join you in welcoming the nominees. Thank you both for your willingness to serve in positions of great responsibility in the Department of Defense, and would also like to thank your family members who, like all military families, sacrifice so much for the security of our nation. So thank you all. And I would also note with a heavy heart the loss of the U.S. Fifth Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Scott Sterney, over the weekend. And I think I share the feelings of all of our colleagues as I extend our condolences to his family, friends, and all who knew him. General McKenzie and General Clark, if confirmed, you will lead combatant commands at the forefront of protecting our national security. As noted by the National Defense Strategy, or the NDS, as the Chairman has indicated, the long-term strategic competitions with China and Russia are the principal priorities for the Department and require both increased and sustained investment. The NDS goes on to say the Department will sustain its efforts to deter and counter rogue regimes such as North Korea and Iran, defeat terrorist threats to the United States, and consolidate our gains in Iraq and Afghanistan while moving to a more resource-sustainable approach. The guidance contained in the NDS is likely to result in significant changes to the commands you have been asked to lead. With respect to U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, the NDS forecasts reduced force structure and more efficient utilization of what remains. Managing the implementation of those changes and any impact they may have on our ability to carry out counterterrorism operations, deter Iran, and reassure our allies and partners will be significant considerations for CENTCOM in the coming years. With respect to U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM, the focus of the NDS raises questions about the role of Special Operations Forces in the competition with potential near-peer adversaries. Given that Special Operations Forces have been heavily committed to the fight against violent extremist groups since 9/11, SOCOM will necessarily have to evaluate whether its current capabilities are appropriately matched the operations its forces will be asked to conduct in the future. Additionally, given the already high operational tempo on Special Operations Forces, SOCOM will need to be careful that any additional responsibilities do not overstress the force. I hope both of our nominees will discuss the expected impact of the NDS on the commands they have been nominated to lead and how any challenges can be mitigated in implementation. Last week, as the Chairman noted, we held a hearing with the National Defense Strategy Commission to discuss their views of the NDS. The Commission's report states that there is a, quote, relative imbalance of civilian and military voices on critical issues of strategy development and implementation. It goes on to state that civilian voices were relatively muted on issues at the center of U.S. defense and national security policy, undermining the concept of civilian control. When I read the Commission's report, I was struck by these observations and the consequences that such an imbalance could have on the development of defense policy, the impact it could have on the civilian and military personnel serving in the Department, and how it may shape the advice provided to the President. As senior members of the Joint Staff, I hope both of our nominees will share their thoughts on the Commission's findings and how their experience with civilian policymakers would shape their leadership of CENTCOM and SOCOM, respectively. On this point, the committee focused attention in recent years on strengthening the partnership between the SOCOM commander and the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, or the ASD-SOLIC. In particular, Section 922 of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017 enhanced the role of ASD-SOLIC to serve as a service secretary-like official responsible for oversight of and advocacy for Special Operations Forces. General Clark, I look forward to hearing your views on the implementation of these reforms and how the ASD-SOLIC-SOCOM partnership can be further strengthened. Again, thank you very much for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reid. We'll now hear from our witnesses. We'll start with you, General McKenzie, and your entire statement will be made a part of the record, so you can abbreviate where you so desire. General McKenzie.
Good morning, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reid, members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you today as the President's nominee to be the next Commander of the United States Central Command. I'm humbled by President Trupp, Secretary Mattis, and Chairman Dunford's faith in me, and grateful for that trust. If confirmed, I look forward to continue serving our nation alongside the dedicated, disciplined, and honorable men and women of the United States Central Command. I'd like to introduce the committee to my wife, Marilyn, who has been my best friend and partner in all our years of service. While I've received much of the credit and attention, Marilyn has quietly but resolutely supported not only me, but the men and women of the Joint Force in all our varied assignments. I'm very proud of her and thankful for her service and steady presence in my life. I'd also like to introduce my son, Kenneth Ray McKenzie, who graduated from the Naval Academy with the class of 2007 and has served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan as a Marine infantry officer. He's now employed in the railroad business in Alabama. Also here is his wife, Kristen, and my sister, Andrea. Safely tucked away with a friend are our 2 grandsons, ages 3 and 5, whom I have, I think wisely, chosen not to inflict on the committee today. I'd like to talk just a moment about the officer seated next to me. In my opinion, the President could not have nominated anyone better to be the next SOCOM commander than Lieutenant General Rich Clark. He is an exceptionally talented, morally grounded, and strategically minded officer. And if we're confirmed, I look forward to the opportunity to continue to march alongside him in Tampa and across the theater. I would also like to pay a brief tribute to General Joe Votel, the current Central Command commander. I believe he is one of the finest generals the U.S. Army has ever produced. Our nation is safer and stronger because of his selfless service. As this committee is aware, the 20 countries that make up the U.S. CENTCOM area of responsibility are as richly diverse and unique as any in the world. They also present a set of vexing challenges. We have vital strategic interests in the Central Command area of responsibility, and we're going to need to stay engaged to address these issues. Under General Votel, Central Command has fostered outstanding relationships across its area of responsibility with myriad senior civilian and military leaders, including those from Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, and across Central Asia. He has also worked tirelessly with our Department of State, the Agency for International Development, and a host of other government and non-government organizations. I pledge to continue that interaction. The work of our colleagues in the Department of State is critical, and if confirmed, supporting them will be a very high priority for me personally. And interaction with allies and partners across the region will also be a matter of great importance. I hope to lead a new generation of CENTCOM professionals to carry on the work of General Votel and those leaders who came before him in meeting these challenges. CENTCOM remains a dangerous theater of war, and we have seen the cost as recently as last week. I am certainly mindful of the burden we have borne in the past and that unfortunately we will continue to bear. I would also like to mention the death of my friend, Vice Admiral Scott Sterney, the 5th Fleet Commander, over the weekend in Bahrain. He will be missed. I vow to this committee that I will faithfully pursue the policies and orders of the President and the Secretary of Defense within the authorities you have provided combatant commanders, and moreover, that I will be open and transparent with you and the rest of Congress. Thank you for considering me, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, General McKenzie. General Clark.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today regarding my nomination to be the next commander of the United States Special Operations Command. I'm grateful to the President, Secretary Mattis, and Chairman Dunford for the trust and confidence in this nomination. Serving our nation has been the greatest privilege of my life, and I come before you grateful and humbled to be considered for the opportunity to continue to serve with the thousands of dedicated soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians in the Special Operations Command that have been and remain on the front lines around the world to keep our nation safe. I'm honored to share this table with my friend and fellow Joint Staff member, a Marine for whom I have the greatest respect due to his intellect, his knowledge of the region, and as a leader who applies common sense touch to every problem. There is none better than Frank McKenzie to assume the U.S. CENTCOM mantle, and if confirmed, our pre-existing relationship and shared mutual respect will benefit the fight we have against terrorism, specifically in the CENTCOM AOR. In the audience is my wife and soulmate of almost 30 years, Suzanne, my bedrock and my best friend since we first met in Berlin American High School, and who has been tremendously supportive of countless Army families during numerous deployments. She is accompanied by our son Will, a senior in high school. Our daughter Madeline is a college junior in Boston and is unable to join us as she gets ready to close out this semester at Tufts University. Suzanne and I are fortunate products of proud Army families that instilled the values of duty, honor, country upon us from the earliest age. While Suzanne's mom and dad cannot be here today, We are grateful for the attendance of my parents, Dick and Gail Clark, and thankful for both of our fathers' service as career Army officers, to include combat in Vietnam and in the Korean conflict. I would like to thank General Tony Thomas for his leadership and example, not only as commander of SOCOM for 3 years, but throughout his storied career. It is an honor to be considered by this committee to follow in his footsteps. Most importantly, I would be remiss if I failed to acknowledge the fallen and their families who have made the ultimate sacrifice for this nation. The human toll hits close to home and serves as a personal reminder of the considered responsibility of this position, as 4 of our recent fallen were all SOCOM warriors. For the past 31 years, your Special Operations Forces provided critical capabilities and options for challenging problems to the Department and our nation, as a result in large measure to the prescient leadership of this Congress with the enactment of the Nunn-Cohen Amendment. Our world continues to evolve and increase in complexity. While violent extremism persists, challenging regional stability and threatening our interest, near-peer competitors grow in both capability and intent to contest our vital national interest. The United States requires capabilities across all elements of national power, and special operations remains a critical part of our defense. If confirmed by this committee, I pledge to work tirelessly with your support to continue to provide our nation with the world's most capable, agile, and lethal Special Operations Forces the world has known. Thank you again, Chairman, Ranking Member, and those on the committee for your consideration.
Thank you, both of you. We're going to be confronted with some difficult decisions. To kind of set the stage for it, in 2010, the budget was if we use constant dollars, let's say 2018 dollars. In 2010, the budget was at $794 billion. And by 2015, using the same constant dollars, it was down to 586. Now that's a drop of 24% is the best way to look at that. So that's where we found ourselves, and so consequently we made a decision for fiscal year 18 to go up to 700 billion, fiscal year 19 up to 716 billion. And the strategy, or the agreement, I should say, both of you have read that commission report, and you remember in that report they talked about the necessity of increasing a minimum increase of 3 to 5% over inflation. Now, that's what everyone agreed on. That's what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed on. That's what the Secretary agreed on. Now, when the President came out with the original budget, it was $733 billion for the fiscal year 20. Well, if you do the math on this thing and you go from 716 to 733, the increase is 2.1%, which is actually below the amount that everyone has been prescribing and saying is going to be necessary to meet the competition. It's a different competition than we've ever had before, at least in my opinion. I would like to ask both of you to comment on that, if you consider in light of that, the 733 to be a floor as opposed to a ceiling. What do you think, General?
Senator, thank you for the question. The 733 figure was arrived at by the Department carefully looking at the requirements of the National Defense Strategy. It reflects our best projection of a strategy-informed budget. We recognize that there could have been a higher number, as you said, the 3 to 5%, but we also recognize that the Department exists within a larger government, and puts and trades there are just a natural part of the process. Anything below 733 would increase risk, and that risk would be manifested across the force. We are in the process now, very carefully across the Department, examining the details of what the nature of that risk would be, who would it be imposed upon, and the nature of it.
Good, good. General Clark.
Senator, I associate myself with General McKenzie's remarks and would state that the sustained and predictable, but then the key is the adequate funding that is required by the Department. And once looked upon, and if confirmed for SOCOM, I have to look at specifically what that means to SOCOM's budget and where that risk would be assumed, whether it's in readiness, whether or not it is in technologies required or whether it is in what we're doing forward.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. In my opening statement, we talked about our peer competitors, Russia and China. And it's difficult for those of us on this side of the table when we're talking to groups outside of government to explain to them that in some cases, both China and Russia have things that we don't have. I have a long list of things, including statements on our artillery. We are outgunned, outranged. And so we have problems now that I don't think we had before. And now from SOCON's perspective, what's the best way you think to confront these problems that we have not experienced before?
So you talked about the things we don't have.
Yeah.
What I would qualify as the things that we do have that Russia and China
Good.
don't have. We do have some asymmetric advantages that we have looked at, and you're familiar with our joint military net assessment. The other thing that we have, Senator, that those two countries don't have is allies and partners. And our position around the world, specifically with SOCON, with our special operations that are forward, do provide us that advantage.
Yeah, that's good. And General McKenzie, there's been a lot of talk about the S-400 and the threat to the United States and the coalition force in Syria. What's your thought about that, evaluating that, and how much of a threat that does pose?
Senator, the S-400, if once activated, will increase the threat to our forces and those of our coalition partners flying over Syria. There will be a manifest difference in the capabilities of the system, though, depending on whether it's manned by the Syrians or the Russians, and we're still working to figure out how that's actually going to be executed.
Yeah, thank you. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the National Defense Commission talked about the private civilian leadership in terms of the interaction with the military, and we talked about this before previously, but for the record, just your reaction to those comments. There's several possibilities. One, they could be noting the absence of civilian leadership, i.e. not enough people have been confirmed yet or nominated, or they're not involved in some way, shape, or form, or there's a gap, a cultural gap between civilians and the military that's growing. So General McKenzie, if you start, then General Clark.
Senator, I believe that in the Department of Defense, final decisions are made by civilians. Final policy recommendations are made by civilians. It's informed by a robust dialogue between the military and the civilians. But when it's all said and done, the Secretary makes the final decision, and probably the last person in the room is going to be his Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the Honorable John Rood. I would argue, just from my observation, that much of this may stem from the slowness of filling appointed positions within the department early on. I do not believe this reflects a structural or a cultural problem, but rather a temporary problem, and I believe if it existed, it has largely been corrected.
Thank you. General Clark, please.
Senator, I concur with General McKenzie's comments. The thing that I would add on top is I work closely with Secretary Rood on a daily basis, and I don't believe this exists. But you stated in your opening about SOCOM and specific the SOLIC aspect of the ASD SOLIC being given control, direction, and authority over SOCOM. I welcome that. I think the advocacy for SOCOM and having that civilian leadership, I clearly understand the military-civilian bounds, and will work closely and directly with ASD West if confirmed.
Thank you. And again, let me address this question to both of you because it involves both your commands, and that's the situation in Afghanistan, which is becoming more complicated, and it was always was complicated. But again, we've lost several service members this week. General Dunford said up in the Halifax conference that we were in a stalemate. How is that stalemate going to affect our operations? I'll start with General McKenzie and then General Clark. And in addition, with Ambassador Khalilzad on the ground, what role will he play? That will be one of your principal missions, General McKenzie.
Senator, thank you. I believe that the operational military situation is largely stalemated, so I agree with the chairman and his assessment of what's happening on the ground. I believe, however, that what has changed and what is new are the efforts of Ambassador Khalilzad. That is a new element in the equation that we have not had before. working to actually try to come to some form of reconciliation and a political end state to the conflict that we've been unable to approach before. There are multiple lines of effort that are working. The military effort, which is stalemated, is one of them. The diplomatic line of effort is alive and being vigorously pursued now by he and other actors in the region.
Thank you. And General Clark in particular, since most outcomes still remaining on the battleground field are terrorist elements. In fact, there is a number of them, I think a long, long list, so that special operations would be concerned going forward with these threats, even if there was some political settlement in another dimension. So could you comment?
Senator, you hit the nail on the head. The Al-Qaeda presence that remains in the APAC region and the ISIS presence that is there currently pose direct threats to the homeland. That's where the SOCOM and the task force that is in Afghanistan continues to support General Miller's efforts. The other piece in the Afghan strategy that I would highlight is the effort to realign our forces. We've doubled the amount of Afghan commandos to be able to help with the strategy to put the pressure on the Taliban. And I think that effort is bearing fruit, and the SOCOM will remain in direct support of General Miller and General McKenzie throughout this effort.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I must recognize General Clark's father, because without his tutelage, I would never have survived plebe swimming at West Point, and so I owe you a lot. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Duly noted. Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Wicker.
General McKenzie, let me just follow up with Senator Reid's questions. How significant is it that the Afghan government formerly controlled 72% of the geographic area of Afghanistan and now controls only 56% of the country?
Senator, is concerning, but it's not a critical factor. They have chosen to defend areas where the population exists, which has been a trade-off in giving up more sparsely populated areas. You'd always prefer to control more, but in a practical military sense, it does reflect most of the country is under their control.
So a lot of these new areas are sparsely populated.
Many of them are, sir. Again, I would note that you'd prefer to eventually control more than what we have now, but I would agree with that.
Okay, and you mentioned Ambassador Khalilzad's efforts. We're certainly optimistic about that, and we think he, at least from my standpoint, I think he knows the issues, he knows the people, and I think we'll be well served there. What would letting up on military pressure do to his diplomatic efforts at this point?
So we believe that it is important to convince the Taliban, even as we are in a stalemate, so they are in a stalemate, and they will be unable to find a path to victory on the battlefield by the actions of the forces on the ground. So therefore, it is critical to maintain unrelenting pressure on the Taliban so that they see the virtue of actually choosing to deal with the diplomatic approach which Ambassador Khalilzad embodies.
Now, let's differentiate the parties there. How large would you say the Taliban is in terms of manpower in Afghanistan?
So I would say 20,000 or more, depends on who you choose to do the counting. It's a substantial group of people on the ground. They're not a monolithic mass, and it's important to understand that also.
So there are different opinions and different loyalties within the Taliban.
Sure there are.
And then in terms of counterterrorism, we are fighting ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations. Tell us about them, the size and strength of those organizations.
So ISIS is a fairly small organization, hundreds to thousands, probably low thousands in eastern Afghanistan. They pose a direct threat to the United States by aspiration. However, right now they're severely constricted both by our operations, and the Taliban has put pressure on ISIS-K as well. Al-Qaeda, much smaller, but with good global interconnections. They also maintain a long-term aspirational goal to attack the West and the United States in particular. What keeps them from being able to do that is the direct pressure that's maintained on them every day by the CT forces in the region, assisted by the ecosystem that is part of the Afghan army and the Afghan government. So that's an important part of the pressure that we place on them as well.
Now, to what extent do do our military and diplomatic leaders, are they able to assess public opinion in Afghanistan about our involvement?
So I believe the Department of State monitors that through a variety of polling mechanisms. They look at it pretty hard. They have the lead for that element of the campaign.
Okay, they have the lead for it, but what is your impression? Do the Afghan people wish we would leave, or are they happy that we're there, and do they support our effort to fight these terrorist organizations and bring the Taliban to the table?
Senator, I believe the Afghan people are weary of war. I think they're a proud people, and in general, they prefer to not have occupation forces, as some of them would view it in their country. But they also recognize the brutality of the Taliban regime. The Taliban enjoys very low, actually, polling numbers with the Afghan public. People remember what it was like back in 2000 and 2001, and Afghanistan was not a good place for women and for a variety of other elements of the Afghan population. People clearly remember that. As with any kind of nation, the data is complex, but there's no agreed, for example, Afghans don't all want us to leave. Elements of the population do, but a lot of Afghans don't want the Taliban to come back and reassert themselves either.
They remember those days prior to 9/11, do not want them to return.
Sir, that is very clear in the data.
Now, so what do we say to the families of the 13 American servicemen who've been killed in Afghanistan this year, or the 1,000 Afghan forces that have been killed in Afghanistan this year?
Sir, what we are doing is we are protecting the homeland of the United States from being attacked. That's what you say to the Americans, and that's a clear, visible, tangible effort that we can honor them for. For the Afghans who have died, it's an attempt to come to a long, peaceful political settlement in their country, and I think that too is an honorable goal. I think Afghans and Americans who've died in action in Afghanistan have all been pursuing an honorable and reasonable objective.
Is the Afghan military in better shape from top to bottom than it's been in recent years?
I think it's in better shape. It has a long way to go. I believe it is in better shape.
Thank you. Well, good wishes to you. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your willingness to consider taking on these assignments at this critical time in our country. I want to go, General McKenzie, to another hot spot in the Middle East, Syria. I appreciated your meeting with me last week, and I think at that time I raised the concerns that I had based on my visit there this summer, that we have made significant gains in the northeast section of Syria and have beaten back ISIS, and life is returning to normal for the people who live there, and am concerned about the fact that right now there is a hold on the stabilization funds for that part of Syria. So can you talk about how we can continue to maintain the gains that we have there without that stabilization money?
Senator, thank you. Eventually, to maintain our gains, we're going to have to adequately resource what follows, which is local security under civilian control, generally speaking, east of the Euphrates River. That's going to require monetary assistance. If it comes from this country, it can come from this country. It could also come, I think, from partners in the region who need to step up to the plate, because the problems in Syria are all actually closer to them than they are to us. So I think, but your point is exactly right. The long-term solution has to be a stability solution. It has to be local, and it has to be appropriately resourced, and that remains a challenge.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. One of the things that we have heard from the administration is that they support the enduring defeat of ISIS. What does that look like to you in the Middle East? What does that mean, the enduring defeat of ISIS?
Senator, the enduring defeat of ISIS is not going to be the absence of ISIS. ISIS, if defeated in the lower Euphrates River Valley, is going to transition to an insurgency. And there are going to be continued attacks from ISIS and derivatives of ISIS, both in the region and really globally. But our goal would be that those attacks typically would be of an intensity and a scope where they'd be able to be contained by local forces that would not necessarily require our assistance in getting to that point. But I want to emphasize that it won't be, for a while, it won't be pretty, it won't be silent. There will be pockets that are going to continue to crop up.
Thank you. General Clark, one of the things that we heard from the Commission report on the NDS from Ambassador Edelman was that he questioned the NDS's suggestion that we are at a point where we can take risk in the Middle East of terrorist attacks in order to address the major power conflict that we're facing again. Can you talk about how SOCOM should balance those two challenges?
Yes, Senator. The first thing that the NDS allows us to do, and I think it's important, is relook our strategies and relook what we're doing and prioritize. So we still have to maintain the counterterrorism pressure on those that are most likely and are inspired and want to attack in our homeland. So we have to keep that pressure up. But at the same time, Special Operations Command is uniquely qualified with its experienced operators, with the maturity of the force, and with the relationships that we have established around the globe with many of our partners through our theater Special Operations Commands that exist inside each combatant commander, to be able to give a global look and to look at allies and partners who those great powers, specifically Russia and China, that through our actions we can counter some of their malign activities.
And would you agree with the conclusion that the Commission drew that right now we've got to do more if we're going to be proactive about addressing the gray zone issues with Russia and China and also some of the cyber threats?
Senator, I do. And one of the key aspects of the National Defense Strategy is expanding the competitive space. The Secretary Mattis is clear on that. And I do believe that SOCOM, as I stated earlier about the capabilities that exist within that command, allow us to expand that competitive space going forward. And if confirmed, I assure the committee that I will personally look into this. And there is a committee report from SOCOM through ASD SOLIC that is due to this committee in the springtime, and I will make sure I pay attention to that report.
Good, thank you. Also, I'm out of time, but can you just briefly address the additional challenges that you see SOCOM facing with taking on the responsibility for WMD?
Senator, the weapons of mass destruction mission that was given to SOCOM 2 years ago didn't come with no resources. It came with almost 100 personnel positions from STRATCOM. But the same approach that SOCOM takes to countering the violent extremist organization, which has a global responsibility, can still be applied to the weapons of mass destruction mission. It's the appropriate mission for SOCOM. I know General Thomas has taken on wholeheartedly, and if confirmed, I will do the same.
Well, thank you again. Thank you both, and thank you for taking time to meet with me.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. General Clark, in your answers to Senator Shaheen, you and I had discussed the same issue. When we see a focus now on great power competition with Russia and with China, what does that do for your forces? You know, I've been told for many years that there are heavy demands on SOCOM, and the demand far exceeds the supply that we have. You seem to be saying that working with partners and allies is going to pick up even more of that extra demand that we're going to be facing. Did I understand you correctly?
Senator, I think working with allies and partners is a critical component to this. I would also state that we're already working with allies and partners in most places through our Theater Special Operations Command.
Where do you think the focus needs to be for the resources that you would have then? And in many cases, they may be limited resources that you're going to have. Where's the investment going to be? What are you going to prioritize with the revenues that you receive?
Senator, I believe the most important aspect of SOCOM are the people. And the people that are performing the mission, wherever it is, whether it's counterterrorism, countering terrorism in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or whether they are inside the Theater of Special Operations Commands, for example, inside the European Command, where they are working with our allies and partners. They're conducting training with Special Operations Forces from nations that are within NATO and within Russia's near abroad.
Would you be asking for increased numbers of personnel?
Senator, right now, I believe that the personnel within SOCOM are adequate. I think if confirmed by this committee, I will take a very hard look myself at how this applies to great power competition. But one thing that I would highlight is that we should look at all missions across the globe, as the Secretary has reprioritized with the NDS, and that Special Operations Command should only do those missions that are suited for Special Operations Command. And those missions that can be adjusted to conventional forces should also go to those conventional forces. And so we have to look at a prioritization of requirements.
The missions that would be more suited to your command, would those be counterterrorism rather than great power?
No, Senator, I do believe there are some unique capabilities within Special Operations Command. I didn't talk about the specifics, but things like the military information support operations is one aspect, civil affairs that and our military information support professionals that exist within the Theater Special Operations Command. Some are actually stationed in embassies around the world in support of the chief of mission at those embassies. Those help build a network. So no, I'm not advocating for additional resources this time, but I am looking for making sure that the people are prioritized in the right places.
And I would say I would certainly support any resources that you would need to complete the missions you are given, sir.
Thank you.
General McKenzie, according to the GAO's October report on Afghan security, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces have improved some fundamental capabilities, such as high-level operational planning, but they continue to rely on the United States and coalition support to fill several key capability gaps. Where do you believe the biggest shortfalls remain in terms of the security forces' ability to conduct its missions? And how do you believe the United States should work to make the Afghan forces more self-sufficient? I know we, in your follow-up here to Senator Wicker, when we're talking about the losses that we suffer as a country when we lose brave military men and women, the Afghan soldiers and police just last year alone lost more than the total that we've seen in the American death toll in 17 years. How can we more effectively support them?
Senator, thank you. I think one of the most important things that we can help the Afghans with is continuing to refine their force generation process, how they recruit, how they train, and how they present forces for actual execution. As you noted, their losses have been very high. They're fighting hard, but their losses are not going to be sustainable unless we correct this problem. And I know that it has General Miller's direct attention, and if confirmed, it would be something that I would like to work with him on as a matter of great importance. The other part of your question talks about the capabilities that we provide them actually in the field, and they range from close air support, which they are now beginning to generate themselves, but we still assist them with intelligence, with CASEVAC when under certain situations, and all the maintenance activities that go into putting a large, complex Army in the field. These are all areas where additional work needs to be done. These are areas that are being addressed by General Miller today in the theater.
Thank you both, and thank you both for visiting with me prior to this hearing. I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Senator Fisher. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today, and also for your willingness to take on some very difficult jobs. So we all appreciate that. General McKenzie, I want to follow up on some of my colleagues' questions related to the National Defense Strategy that we had presented to us last week. And I want to read a portion of that report that I think is particularly significant, and I quote, while the United States was focused on counterterrorism and defeating insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan, Russia and China were focused on acquiring capabilities to overcome America's technological edge and operational reach As a result, America has been losing its military advantage in a number of key warfighting areas, is the quote, which I think is significant and one that is certainly one that is very significant to the work that this committee does and the work that you do each and every day. The report goes on to suggest that Congress needs to invest in new capabilities and operational concepts. And that leads to my concern about Afghanistan, where we are still spending $45 billion a year in Afghanistan. And given the focus of the new National Defense Strategy, my question to you, sir, is, if confirmed, how will you adjust requested requirements for Afghanistan given the strategy's focus on great power competition?
Sir, I'd like to begin by completely agreeing with the NDS Commission's assessment. In fact, over the last decade and a half and even longer, our two principal competitors, Russia and China, have carefully studied us while we've been engaged principally in the CENTCOM theater. They have used that opportunity to steal a march, and they have made those investments based on a very careful study of our potential weaknesses. So I think that's very good analysis. Senator, I think the way forward in Afghanistan is to try to reach a political settlement that is going to allow us to remove elements of our presence that are there now. The key thing, though, that we need to bear in mind as we look at a future in Afghanistan is our long-term interest is preventing attacks being generated against the homeland. So we have to provide for that in any potential future political settlement. And that is what we're looking to Ambassador Khalilzad to work on right now. I believe that does present a long-term way forward, and I think we're going to know more about it here in the near future.
Now, we've been hearing about this for as long as I've been in Congress. I've been hearing about the need for the political settlement and having Department of State involved. So this isn't a new strategy, at least in terms of what I've been hearing over many years. And the other thing that I've heard, and I think I heard it again here today from you as well, is the necessary capability requirements for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Ultimately, they have to be able to stand up and defend their country. That's going to be also critical to get a political settlement, is to have security forces in Afghanistan with Afghan people defending themselves. So my question to you directly is how far are the Afghan security forces from having the capability to secure their country without the presence of 15,000 United States soldiers and Marines and airmen?
Senator, I'll reply equally directly. They're not there yet, and if we left precipitously right now, I do not believe they would be able to successfully defend their country. I think it's a conditions-based approach. We're going to go through this winter. We'll see how they do in the fourth generation phase of this winter. But I don't know how long it's going to take. I think that one of the things that would actually provide the most damaging to them would be if we put a timeline on it. And we said we're going out at a certain point in time. As we've seen when we precipitously withdrew from Iraq earlier, certain effects probably follow from that. Senator, I don't know how long it will take. I do know that we're working it very hard. I do know they are making improvements. I do know that today it would be very difficult for them to survive without our coalition partners' assistance, and we should remember that NATO and a number of other nations are with us on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to put a number on when we withdraw. I agree you cannot put just a time out there to say that we're going to be pulling out. You want to make sure that the Afghan forces have the capability to stand up and do the work on their own. But we've been at it for 17 years. 17 years is a long time. What are we doing differently when it comes to the Afghan security forces that we haven't done for 17 years while being focused on this?
Senator, I understand your frustration. I've been there twice. My son's been there twice. I would take two things. First, we are doing things significantly different with the Afghan security forces. They are doing the fighting. Americans are still at risk, and as we saw tragically last week, Americans are still going to go in harm's way, and some of them may die. But we are no longer doing the fighting. They are doing the fighting. They're doing it imperfectly, but they are doing it with our assistance in those niche capabilities that we talked about a little before. So that is actually a new thing. The other thing, Senator, that is new, and I completely understand your reference that we've been pursuing a diplomatic solution for 17 years, not in the manner in which we are now. Not with an empowered envoy that is actually talking directly to the Taliban, where we have the opportunity to bring them together. Senator, I believe this is a new thing, and I may be wrong, but I believe this is a new opportunity for us, and the military campaign is in direct support of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance today and for your willingness to continue to serve our country in new positions. Thanks to your families for loaning you to our country for so long. General Clark, let's speak about SOCOM's budget. At a time of tight budgets, when some in the administration are already talking about cutting 5% from the Department of Defense budget, many people say, but that's okay because the Special Operations Command, which is bearing so much of the fight, will be fully funded. Can you talk about your dependence on the rest of the conventional military and how our Special Operations forces fight with them, and why stable, predictable, and increasing funding for those conventional forces is so important for the Special Operations Command?
Senator, thanks. There are 5 special operations truths. The 5th truth of that is most special operations require non-special operations force assistance. I believe in that truth, and we see it apparent every day in the operations in which special operations conduct. Especially for longer-term, enduring missions where special operations, we need the support of the services in all of those and the conventional force. The other aspect I think I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight is that Special Operations Command is made up of the services. Much of the recruitment, much of the force is actually started in conventional force and actually came up through the ranks, and they were identified as some of the best of breed in that particular service in which they served, and then they raised their hand and volunteered for the special operations. So the services are inherently important to SOCOM.
Thank you. General McKenzie, there's already been a lot of talk this morning about the implications of the National Defense Strategy, both for Central Command and for Special Operations Command, and its focus on near-peer or peer competition, what it means for the Middle East, where we've primarily fought counterinsurgency wars over the last 15 years. But obviously there is one power in the Middle East that has the resources and the power of a nation state, Iran. It's not a peer competitor or even a near-peer competitor, but it does have the abilities that only a nation state can marshal to threaten U.S. interests. Can you talk about what the National Defense Strategy means for you in Central Command relative to the threat of Iran?
Senator, thank you. The long-term, enduring, most significant threat in the U.S. CENTCOM AOR is Iran, and Iran's malign, hegemonistic ambitions across the theater and indeed globally. And that's clearly recognized in the NDS. There are 5 principal threats to the nation that are identified in the National Defense Strategy. Iran is one of those. It is below the threats of Russia, which can destroy us, and China, which can seriously injure us. But Iran also has that capability, and they're exploiting their malign views every day in the theater. So how the Central Command AOR, the Central Command, will be forced to deal with those is, first of all, recognize that there is going to be a force reposture to some degree in Central Command. We've already begun to see elements of that as we talk about how often carriers come into the Central Command AOR. It's going to require the command to adopt innovative new techniques to maintain deterrence against Iran, because that is sort of the underpinning of everything else that will go on in the theater, is the ability to deter Iran and respond if required to.
If Iran's leadership were to miscalculate and to challenge a U.S. Navy vessel in the Persian Gulf, or say close the Strait of Hormuz, do you have any doubt that the United States military is postured in the Central Command area of responsibility to meet that challenge?
Senator, I'm confident we can respond. And what I would also caveat it a little bit, the element of risk would be the time it would take us to reassert ourselves. And we can do it very quickly, or it might be a little bit later. But when it's all said and done, we will reassert the status quo antebellum.
While we're talking about Iran, can we talk about what's happening in Yemen and the extent to which Iran is supporting the Houthi forces in Yemen and the implications for U.S. security and our partner security there?
So when we talk about Yemen, I think it's important to remember that Iran is behind the irresponsible behavior that actually led to the overthrow of the government of Yemen and actually created the situation that we now have in Yemen itself. So Iran has been extraordinarily irresponsive as a nation in what they've done in Yemen, and that has had a large factor in driving the conflict forward.
Ballistic missiles are being launched from Houthi-controlled territory into Saudi Arabia to include in the vicinity of Saudi Arabia's international airport in Riyadh, where Americans fly in and out of every day. I'm not aware of ballistic missile manufacturing companies in Yemen, are you?
So I'm not. We are confident that those missiles come from another place. They're smuggled in. They're typically assembled there with Iranian assistance, and then they're employed by the Houthis, both against the kingdom as well as against UAE, and as you know also irresponsibly into the Bab el-Mandeb area and into the Red Sea where vital oil transport occurs.
My time has expired. Thank you again, gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Congratulations on the nominations. Look forward to working together with you should you be confirmed. General McKenzie, I want to start off talking about Afghanistan, as many have. One of the recent deaths in Afghanistan was a Virginian, Army Captain Andrew Ross, who has family in both Lexington and Richmond, very beloved individual, and we feel that very deeply, his death. You've been asked a number of questions. I just want to ask this. The stalemate's disappointing, and I was in Halifax as well when General Dunford talked about the stalemate. But it's one thing to have a stalemate with 14,000 American troops there. It's another thing to have a stalemate with 100,000. We're down from a peak of 100,000 to 14,000, and it seems to be that that's about the number that's required right now to provide the ancillary support to enable the Afghans to have this fight. Are you aware of any plans by this administration to significantly, in the near or medium term, change that number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan?
Senator, I'm not aware of any plans.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me ask you about Syria, General McKenzie. How do you understand the U.S. military mission in Syria?
Senator, the U.S. military mission in Syria is designed to finish ISIS, the physical caliphate of ISIS, off in the lower Euphrates River Valley. That is the principal objective of our operations in Syria.
Principal objective. One of the things that I've been confused on the committee is that is always stated as either the objective or the principal objective. There is a sort of a good faith debate in this committee and elsewhere about whether the 2001 authorization for use of military force covers that objective, but many scholars believe that it does. But we also occasionally read or hear at committee meetings like this figures from the administration articulate additional objectives where the legal rationale is not, frankly, even covered by the 2001 authorization. So, for example, the United States has taken action against the Syrian government, twice launching missile strikes against the Syrian government in response to use of chemical weapons, but has also undertaken military action against the Syrian government when the Syrian government has made gains against the Free Syrian Army in space where ISIS is not that much of a factor. Do you understand the mission in Syria, the American mission in Syria, to include pushing back or attempting to topple the Syrian government?
Sir, I do not believe the mission in Syria includes that objective.
It has often been stated both by cabinet secretaries, especially Secretary of State, that part of the mission in Syria is to provide a check against Iran. Do you understand that as a reason for American military presence in Syria?
Senator, that may possibly be a derived effect of our presence on the ground. That is not a mission that we are undertaking.
Is Iran working in tandem with ISIS as far as you know?
Iran is certainly not doing a lot against ISIS. They're pursuing other objectives there. They are intermittently working against ISIS, but not as consistently as, for example, we are.
Iran is backing up the Syrian government. Is the Syrian government working against ISIS or indifferent to ISIS?
I think they have pretty much consider the ISIS threat over. They're turning to crush the last remnants of opposition against the Assad government now, Senator.
We often hear it stated in press and even in this hearing that part of the U.S. military presence in Syria is to provide a check against Russian influence. Is that your understanding as an objective of U.S. military presence in Syria?
It is not. Again, it may be a derived observed effect. It is clearly not an objective of our presence in Syria.
Last thing I want to do is just say a word about the debate we're currently having about Yemen, to follow up a little bit on Senator Cotton's questions. And this is just sort of a statement to share with you. I think one of the reasons that this body is considering on the floor a declaration that we are not involved in, that we are not to be considered or take military action in support of the Saudis in the Yemeni civil war. One of the reasons we're having a debate is sort of a credibility issue, including credibility of what we've been told by the military. We have had military leaders look at the Senate and say that we are not involved in hostilities to support either side in the Yemeni civil war. And when we've pointed out that the U.S. is refueling Saudi jets on the way to bombing runs in Yemen, we're told that that's not assisting in the hostilities. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 defines hostilities to include aiding allies and moving troops into hostilities. But we've had military leadership look us in the face and tell us that refueling Saudi jets on the way to bombing runs is not hostilities. Many of the bombs that have killed civilians in Yemen are made in the United States and either provided to Saudi Arabia via military sales or from U.S. companies. But again, we're told the U.S. is not involved in hostilities. I think one of the reasons that we're having this debate on a matter that's pending before the Senate right now is we don't like being told, and we're proxies for the American public, we don't like being told we're not involved in hostilities when bombs are falling that are made in the United States and when U.S. jets are involved in refueling Saudi bombing runs into Yemen. We're insulted by that. I think we just need to be candid about what we're doing and not doing. And I'm not asking for a response for either of you from this, but I'm just saying one of the reasons we're having this debate, I'm convinced right now, is because we've been told some things from the administration and from military leadership in the last months that we find frankly incredible, and we don't find that to be believable. And so the debate will clarify as a matter of policy from the Article 1 branch that's supposed to be the declarer of war, military action, especially against a nation. This will be a clarifying debate, and I think it's one that we need to have. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Let's see. Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Generals Clark and General McKenzie, I want to thank you both and your families for your decades of service to our nation. General Clark, there's been considerable discussion on the stress of the Special Operations Force after 17 years of continuous operations and the doubling of the force during that same time frame. Can you discuss from your perspective the difference in the quality of individual special operators in 2001 and now, and the challenges the command faces in maintaining that quality? And what do you need from Congress proactively to make certain that special operator quality remains unmatched in the face of operational requirements, which we all know will not be reduced?
Senator, thanks for that question and thanks for your support. The quality of special operations since 2001, I think, has actually increased. The experience that our special operations operators have gained throughout the world in the activities in which they have participated have made them better and have made them stronger. And I still stick with the quality is more important than the quantity, one of the soft truths. And so as we look at that quality, the standards have not changed. We have not lowered standards within SOCOM in any of the specialties that support, and they all have their own individual standards which they have to meet. And the other piece I would highlight for the committee is as you specifically mentioned stress on the force, and as the Secretary has stated, first line of effort is build a more lethal and agile force, an adaptive force, and that a lot of that goes to readiness and the readiness of the force that we have. The Secretary has given guidance to the department in terms of having a 2-to-1 dwell ratio. So for every month deployed, a special operations warrior has to be back home for 2 months to reset. So that 3 months would be equate to 9. I think those things, as we look at our force, are crucial. And as far as what Congress can do and what this committee can do, I think it's the sustainable, predictable funding for SOCOM that allow it to have the special programs that it does have and the soft, unique equipment that has been recognized by this committee as crucial to our mission.
Thank you. General McKenzie, you come into CENTCOM during a time in which there is clearly a discussion here within the Senate with regards to the role that we would play in Yemen. Most recently, and I think the discussion was here in which you didn't get an opportunity to respond with your thoughts concerning the role that this country plays in the activity in Yemen today. I'd like, from your perspective, based upon what's going on there today, your thoughts about the need to either support the efforts there to come to a a peaceful resolution, and what the role of our nation should be in trying to bring all of the different sides to the negotiating tables and the critical need at this juncture to maintain a steady course. Could you talk a little bit about the role that you see right now from a policy perspective with regard to the activities in Yemen?
Senator, thank you for the question. When we look at Yemen, there are really two things we look at, and the most important thing remains the ability to apply direct CT pressure to al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula and to ISIS on the Arabian Peninsula. We should all remember that before 2001, an attack against a U.S. warship initiated by AQAP down in Aden was actually one of the early attacks of this long war that we're in now. So they have an aspiration to attack the United States. They are prevented from generating that only because of the direct pressure that remains on them. So that is a clear, unequivocal national interest of the United States. Senator, I believe that the best solution in Yemen would be a negotiated solution that we're hopefully beginning to maybe see the leading edge of now with Martin Griffin and other members of the United Nations that are attempting to bring parties to a ceasefire that will allow for the distribution of food, and the Houthis bear a large measure of that blame for not distributing that food, but an attempt to get to a situation where the large fraction, almost 2/3 of the population of Yemen that is at food risk now, can be appropriately addressed. I think that is an important thing. I believe our ability to participate and drive those discussions require that we remain in contact with both UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you both for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, General McKenzie and General Clark, for being here today. So I want to go back to Yemen. For over 3 years, the Saudi Arabia-led coalition warplanes, refueled and armed with missiles by the United States, have been bombing Yemeni territory to counter Iranian-backed militias as part of a dangerous proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this week, the Senate advanced a resolution that would, if it became law, cut off all U.S. support for Saudi-led coalition's bombing campaign in Yemen. So I just want to make sure that we're all clear about what's going on. I think it would be helpful for the American people to understand how we have directly contributed to the situation in Yemen since March of 2015. And we seem to have had some challenges in getting this on the record. So let me start here. General McKenzie, we provide both intelligence support and military advice to the Saudis for targeting Houthi and Saleh-aligned forces in Yemen. Is that correct?
Senator, it is, with the important exception that the intelligence we're providing them is not target-level intelligence.
Well, it is intelligence. I just want to make sure I've got this. Are you saying that we provide intelligence support and military advice? Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And until November 11th of this year, we refueled Saudi-led coalition strike air force that bombed these targets in Yemen. Is that right?
Senator, that is correct.
And Saudi aircraft routinely drop both guided and unguided bombs, some of which are sold by U.S. defense contractors, drop them on these targets in Yemen. Is that correct?
Senator, that's correct.
So we've got intelligence, we've got refueling, we've got bombs, we've got military advice. You know, you and I talked yesterday about our military relationship with Saudi Arabia, and I know that you think that continuing the campaign in Yemen is in our interest, but I respectfully disagree on this. Yemen is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Millions of people are on the brink of starvation. It is the worst cholera outbreak in modern history. Thousands of civilians have been killed, thousands more wounded. Children have starved to death. Neither side is winning this proxy war, and the Yemeni people are suffering. I think it is time to reevaluate our relationship with Saudi Arabia in light of its actions not only in Yemen, but with the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And we need to ask ourselves if the benefits of this relationship with Saudi Arabia is worth the costs if this kind of behavior continues. And that's why I co-sponsored this bipartisan resolution that would stop our involvement in Saudi military operations in Yemen unless Congress provides specific authorization for it. So I want to ask about one other area while I have time, and that is the nuclear deal between the United States and 5 partner nations and Iran. that placed Iran's nuclear program under limits and inspections so that it could not develop a nuclear weapon. So far, this deal has worked, and Iran's compliance has been verified repeatedly by international inspectors. But President Trump has put this deal at risk when he unilaterally withdrew the United States and imposed all sanctions on Iran that were meant to be suspended as a condition of Iran's compliance with the agreement. Now, the Director of National Intelligence Worldwide Threat Assessment from this year said in part that the Iran deal has, quote, extended the amount of time Iran would need to produce fissile material for a nuclear weapon from a few months to about 1 year, and, quote, has enhanced the transparency of Iran's nuclear activities. General McKenzie, do you agree with the intelligence community's assessment?
Senator, I do agree with the assessment.
And aside from the current nuclear agreement, at this time, are you aware of any alternative binding diplomatic agreement that would prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon?
Senator, I'm not.
And since the Trump administration violated the nuclear deal by unilaterally withdrawing from it and reimposing sanctions, has the Iranian government significantly reduced its destabilizing activities?
Iranian destabilizing activities across the region were active before, during, and after the JCPOA.
Okay, so no effect. You know, there's no other binding diplomatic agreement to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, and we know that Iran's government is a bad actor, but I think it's easier to counter Iran's destabilizing behavior if it has no nuclear weapon than it would be if it did have nuclear weapons. If Iran maintains itself in compliance, then I believe the president should reverse his reckless decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions, because the deal makes America safer and makes the world safer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And gentlemen, thank you very much for your years of service to our wonderful, great United States of America. I want to thank your families as well for being here today. We understand how important they are to your success as well. So thank you very much. We understand that SOCOM and CENTCOM have been really centrist in our fight against terrorism in the last 17 years. And now that we see the National Defense Strategy rightly prioritizing the great power competition with adversaries like China and Russia, we still have to understand that there continues the fight, the counterterrorism fight, and the fight against VEOs in the CENTCOM region. So as my position as the subcommittee chair on emerging threats and capabilities, I do look forward to continuing to work with you and focusing on the Middle East so that we can put as much pressure on those organizations as possible. So thank you for the great work in that area. Senator Reid, I know that earlier you said, as we focus on families, that Mr. Clark had been very helpful to you. I want to acknowledge, were you in rock swimming?
Yes, I was in rock swimming and barely graduated because of that. But I know your daughter is probably the best swimmer in her class.
Well, she is a swimmer. I won't say the best swimmer. But because we do focus very heavily on our families, and especially with SOF, it is very important that we focus on all aspects of our special operators, whether it is their training and qualifications, the family support. It is very important. And General Clark, you brought up the soft truths that exist out there. There are 5 of them. One of them is that special operations cannot be mass produced either. And on Friday, I had the honor of attending Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, where I had the great honor of securing the latest Hell Week class with the newest buds there, as well as speaking to the SQT, the SEAL Qualification Training Course, before they pinned on their tridents. These young men really have spent months and months, if not years, enduring some of the toughest physical and mental challenges known to our our fighting men and women. And we want to do all that we can to support them. This has been discussed earlier, but the pool of qualified folks that are able to go into special operations is very small, and you acknowledge that they come from all service branches. So what can we do to further recruit and retain the best of the best, knowing that we do need these elite special fighters?
Senator, one of the most important things we do is work through the services for that. And it's critical that the services also have the tools and means, and a lot of that is funding. Because this, as the Secretary said last week, and this is not just an all-voluntary force, but this is also a recruited force for our nation. Mm-hmm. And we have opened up, as you well know, Special Operations Forces across all genders. We want the best of the people who have the physical, the intellectual, and the desire to serve in our special operations community, to be able to serve in our special operations community. And then specifically, some of the things that this committee has done is provide the tools and the resources for SOF to be able to take care of its service members and families, specifically the preservation of the Force and Family program and the warrior care that is given to our SOCOM operators as a SOF specific piece, because our operators have to work in the shadows. They have to work in places that are sensitive, things that they can't talk about. And to have a program that is specific to their needs of them that are on the front lines, but then there's their families who are waiting for them to come home. This has been a critical part for our Special Operations Command, and I thank this committee for that.
Yes, and thank you. And thank you for acknowledging POTUF. That's where I was going to drive next, because POTUF is an incredible combination of support for our warriors as well as for our families, which, again, I want to acknowledge are so very important to the men that serve in your organization as well as women. But I was able to also, while I was at Coronado, spend some time with their POTUF team and visiting with their psychologist. And I think it's incredible that we are actually able to embed our psychologists with our various teams of operators across the force, and understanding that we not only need to make sure that they are physically and spiritually ready, but also mentally capable to drive on to their next mission. So thank you so much. Again, gentlemen, thank you for your years of service, and to your families, God bless you for the great support that you give. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both. It's good to see both of you again. Aloha. These are two questions that I ask of every nominee who comes before any of the 5 committees on which I sit. It's part of my responsibility to ensure the fitness of nominees for appointments to senior positions and positions of power within the administration. So I'd like to ask each of you following 2 questions. I'll start with you, General McKenzie. Since you became a legal adult, have you ever made unwanted requests for sexual favors or committed any verbal or physical harassment or assault of a sexual nature?
Never, Senator.
General Clark.
Never, Senator.
Second question, have you ever faced discipline or entered into a settlement relating to this kind of conduct?
I have not, Senator.
No, I have not, Senator.
Thank you. General McKenzie, I am concerned that there is not enough effort being put to our diplomatic regions in the CENTCOM region, and I brought this up in our discussion earlier when we met. The fact that we do not have an ambassador to Egypt or Pakistan, and just recently nominated an ambassador to Saudi Arabia, suggests that the administration hasn't taken all of the steps it should to support diplomacy in the region. Will you support fully staffing the diplomatic missions in the region and work with them to increase regional stability?
Senator, I will.
That means lending your voice to the fact that we need to fill these positions. You mentioned in your testimony, General McKenzie, that we are in a military stalemate in Afghanistan, and in fact, of course, that's also acknowledged by Chairman Dunford. And the only path to peace in Afghanistan is a diplomatic path. And General McKenzie, in your response to questions from this committee, you said that there is a role for Pakistan in reaching this kind of settlement. So why did you say that? Are there any indications that Pakistan wishes to play that kind of a role with regard to Afghanistan?
Senator, I do believe that any solution in Afghanistan is going to require the assistance of Pakistan. It has to be a regional solution, not just a solution centered in Afghanistan. It is in Pakistan's long-term interests to have a government in Afghanistan that is stable, that they can do business with. So I think Pakistan has not shown indications, by and large, over the last few years, of being a serious partner in this regard. Ambassador Khalilzad is meeting with the Pakistanis very soon to see if we can find some way forward. It will be hard to reach a settlement without some form of assistance from Pakistan.
And you say that Pakistan has still not acknowledged that it has a potential major role to play.
I believe Pakistan knows very clearly that their assistance will be required to reach an end state in Afghanistan. I think the task that we have is to make it attractive to them so that they see that it is in their best interest to do that.
And I think when you use the words like attractive to them, that means that they would want something from us in return for playing any kind of a positive role and bringing about a reconciliation, which, by the way, reconciliation in Afghanistan means that the Taliban will have a role to play, a major role to play in the further governance of Afghanistan.
Senator, I believe that it does, and if I could, just very briefly, I'd like to correct an earlier remark. I noted the size of the Taliban in Afghanistan at being 20,000. I believe would actually say it's around 60,000, vice that earlier number.
General McKenzie, you were asked some questions about the nuclear deal that the United States entered into with other nations, and you said today that Iran has not ceased or cut back on its malign activities in the Middle East before, during, or after the nuclear deal. And the nuclear deal did not have anything to do with stopping Iran from these kinds of activities in the Middle East, correct?
Sir, Senator, that is correct.
So why do you think the president used Iran's malign activities in the Middle East as a reason for unilaterally pulling out of the nuclear deal?
Senator, I can't speculate.
I think that's called a rhetorical question. Let me get to you, General Clark, excuse me. How many personnel are there in SOCOM?
Senator, there's 70,000
70,000
personnel.
And you testified today that that SOCOM should only be involved in those missions suited for SOCOM, and that missions suited for conventional forces should remain or go to the conventional forces. Is this kind of delineation clear within the Department of Defense, and is that reflected in what SOCOM does?
Senator, I believe the Secretary has been very clear in those lines that SOCOM should be specific to SOCOM missions. So I don't think there's any issue or delineation within the Department of Defense for that.
Well, this is because of our understanding that SOCOM has been deployed often to the point where there is a major stress on SOCOM, and I think you mentioned that there are attempts underfoot to, ongoing, I should say, to relieve the stress on the deployments of SOCOM. So is that because of the understanding that the delineation for what SOCOM should be doing and what our conventional forces should be doing really needs to be adhered to?
Senator, with the publishing of the National Defense Strategy and relooking the prioritization of the force, it's given us a very good opportunity to relook all of our deployments, look where the forces are, and make sure that SOCOM forces are, in fact, dedicated to the missions that are most important and are specific to Special Operations Forces.
Thank you. Thank you both for your responses to our questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join my colleagues in thanking both of you gentlemen for your willingness to continue to serve our country, and also join those who have noted the families and the sacrifices that they make. I join in that thanks as well. There's been a great deal of discussion here today about the new National Defense Strategy and the Commission report on that strategy. I had the good fortune of both serving as a member of that commission to the time that we finished our deliberations, and then having gotten appointed to the Senate, now am in a position to try to do something about it. One of the things is to help bring attention to what the strategy and the Commission's report about that strategy really require. I'd like to just make a comment and then get your reaction. Everybody has noted the fact that the new defense strategy of the Secretary has dramatically reprioritized U.S. interest, putting the potential threat from China and Russia at the top of the list, and then relegating the threats from countries like Iran and North Korea and the terrorist threats to a subsidiary level. And that's in contrast to what we have been doing over the last 8 to 10 years. What the Commission has noted is that that reprioritization has certain consequences. And one of the consequences is what we spend our money on. The money will need to be spent on being able to defeat and therefore, and this is of course the key, deterring Russia and China from ever seeking to have conflict with us. That means that we're going to have to, instead of putting our first available dollars into readiness to support worn-out troops and equipment that's been used in the Middle East, for example, we're going to have to put the first dollars into long-term expensive research and development and acquisition projects to take advantage of a lot of new technology and to try to blunt some of the new technology that these peer adversaries have been developing against us. This has to do with hypersonics and directed energy and space and all of those things that require some new ways of conducting war. It requires some continuing work and greater dedication to the modernization of our nuclear deterrent. Unfortunately, some bills are coming due all at the same time, not only the life extension of the nuclear weapons and the rebuilding of the laboratory complexes, but also all three parts of our triad wearing out and therefore having to be redeveloped and deployed at the same time, the air leg, the missile leg, and the submarine leg. And it has been noted as costing upwards of $1 trillion over 30 years, but that still represents at its peak maybe 6.2 or 3% of the defense budget. We're going to have to take advantage of allies and assist them, position ourselves as close as we can get to potential areas of conflict. We're going to have more sea and air transport because the new strategy calls for having to move things around in the event of a conflict. We don't have enough now to be able to have everything we need in every theater against every potential enemy. So we'd have to reposition forces from Europe to Southeast Asia, for example. Now, we also noted, the Commission noted, that the forces in Southeast Asia are not necessarily the ones you would want to fight a land war in Europe. Likewise, the land war in Europe forces are not necessarily the ones that would be best to be sending to a potential area of conflict with the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, though we'll do our best to do all of that with the capability we have, we understand that there will be risks that will have to be taken. Where are those risks? Well, unfortunately, they fall right into your lap because they deal with the threats that you have to deal with all of the time. And I just wanted to ask you if you understand that that is the strategy that is being suggested here, and do you understand the risks to that strategy that the Commission has reported on? And to tell us just a little bit about your thoughts on it. I know, General Clark, for example, you said, well, we need sustainable and predictable funding, and that's exactly what the Commission said we needed, in addition to more of the top line, above 3 to 5% above inflation. So your thoughts on all of that?
Senator, I'll begin, then turn it over to Rich here. I was the J5 in a prior life. Rich relieved me in that job, so I was present at the creation. I'm intimately familiar with the NDS, and I am in fact fully embrace the principles that it has. I recognize that in my AOR in particular, if confirmed, that there would be increased risk. We're going to have to be prepared to shift forces. But I think the answer to that, Senator, just to select one thing to briefly talk about, would be that we have to examine all problems globally. And we have a thought process in mind that would allow us to rapidly shift forces across the globe to respond. And that dynamic force employment is what we know that term as, the term of art we use inside the Joint Staff. But because those margins that you've described have grown so narrow, they're no longer purely regional solutions to anything. Every solution, even a regional one, has to have a global component, and I'll pause there.
So as the current J5, having relieved the gentleman sitting next to me, also familiar with the National Defense Strategy, the central idea also of the National Defense Strategy is to compete, deter, and win. And I think that competition aspect, so that we compete and we're able to deter so we don't have to fight that fight, it does go to the readiness of the force, and it does go to the technologies that are required to be able to deter our enemies. And I think that is a balance that we have to look at. It's going to be up for the Secretary to determine where those risks and puts or takes are going forward, but it's something we are very familiar with and support the National Defense Strategy.
General, I'll just conclude. The Commission concluded that the strategy could be a very effective strategy if adequately resourced, and that's the caveat that we attach to it. I thank you again very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Kyle. Senator Cruz.
Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for your service. Let's start by talking about Iran. General McKenzie, could you give your thoughts as to the short-term and long-term threat posed by Iran?
Senator, the most significant long and short-term threat in the Central Command theater is Iran and Iran's ambitions both in the theater and also to a degree globally.
How do you assess the impact of the President's decision pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal?
Sir, as we spoke just a few moments ago, I would say that Iran's malign behavior in the theater hasn't abated from before, during, or after the nuclear deal in the other domains which I see, which is their development of ballistic missiles, their activities both in Syria and in Yemen and in other nations across the AOR.
So let's take those one piece at a time. In terms of ballistic missiles, what are we seeing? What's their capability, and what is the threat of those ballistic missiles?
Iran has chosen to substitute ballistic missiles, both short and medium and long range, for their paucity of aviation assets. So they have an aggressive developmental program going forward that would include an aspiration to develop an ICBM.
And how close do you assess they are to having an ICBM that could hit the continental United States?
Well, they're testing, and we watch their space launch vehicle with great interest because, as we've seen in other places around the world, that is technology that is easily transferred from a space launch vehicle to an ICBM of significant range.
And what would be the national security threat posed to the United States if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons?
Should Iran acquire nuclear weapons, I think that they've been inimically opposed to us for many years. You would always, and so you can only speculate what they might do with those weapons, but I can't imagine that anything good would proceed from Iran possessing a weapon of great striking power and ability to destroy.
How would it impact the region if Iran were to become a nuclear power?
Senator, I believe it would be a destabilizing in the region if Iran procured nuclear weapons. It would possibly lead to other nations pursuing nuclear weapons. It would lead to the worst of all outcomes for us, which would be widespread proliferation of those weapons across the theater.
And describe for this committee Iran's conduct in terms of spreading and fomenting and funding terror.
Senator, we see it active in Yemen. Actually, the humanitarian tragedy that we confront in Yemen is the child of Iranian ambitions in Yemen and their support for the Houthis and trying to create a Hezbollah-like state there. So that proceeds directly from them. We see the same activities in Syria as well, where they are actively supported and actively participating in supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad and all that proceeds from that and the terror that he has inflicted on his own people. Just to cite two examples, Senator.
And what's been the state of the Iranian economy following our withdrawal from the nuclear deal?
Pressure remains on the Iranian economy. As you know, Senator, it's hard to see there. We look, but it's hard hard to know, but I believe there is pressure on the Iranian economy. It remains to be seen if they're going to be able to work with other countries that will seek to circumvent some of the sanctions that are on them. Don't know the answer to that, and I'm probably not the best person to describe that, but I believe there is pressure on the Iranian economy.
But even with that pressure on the economy, have you seen any indications of their scaling back their terror activity, funding of Hezbollah and Houthis and other terrorists?
I've seen nothing appreciable change, Senator.
What's your assessment? We saw earlier this year significant protests against the Ayatollah and the mullahs. What's your assessment of the degree of unrest and dissatisfaction among the Iranian people with the regime?
Senator, it's an authoritarian regime that responds very harshly. And so I haven't seen anything, and I defer to the intelligence community for a better look at that, but I haven't seen anything that I would characterize as spreading or essentially threatening the fundamental nature of the Iranian regime.
Now, we've certainly seen in the past that Iran has a long history of making promises and then breaking those promises. What do you see as the likelihood that they either have initiated or will initiate again a nuclear program working to develop nuclear weapons?
Senator, I think we should watch very closely. We should watch very closely that possibility.
Gentlemen, thank you both for your service.
Sure.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General McKenzie, that was a very good dialogue with Senator Cruz. I commend you for your quick and sharp responses. Given the fact that the U.S.-supported coalition has really routed ISIS in Syria, in Iraq, what's next? And weave your answer in with not necessarily just ISIS, but Al-Qaeda and other groups in the areas such as Yemen, any place that there is chaos, some of the regions of North Africa, the Horn of Africa, et cetera.
Senator, thank you for that question. I would say this. We are seeing the fruits of the military campaign in Iraq, where a government is in the process of seating itself, where we're now prepared to move forward to true building partner capacity activities with the government of Iraq going forward. So we're seeing the fruits of some success there. I don't want to oversell it because ISIS is still active in pockets in Iraq, but Iraqi security forces are generally proving effective at squashing them when they appear. And as I've noted earlier, I believe that the long-term success for ISIS is not going to be the complete disappearance of the entity, but rather the ability of local security forces to be able to deal with the problem when it does arise. So that's in Iraq. Senator, in Syria, I think that we are very close to finishing the physical destruction of the caliphate. The same thing will obtain. They will transition to a counterinsurgency. More activity will be needed. I think the solution in Syria that we would like to see would be a politically informed solution where all parties have a seat at the table, and we'll see how that goes forward. But the military component of that is coming to a very near to an end. I wouldn't want to put a timeline on it, but it's coming close. Senator, very briefly, the last thing I'll just talk about is Yemen, where we maintain unrelenting pressure on both ISIS in the Arabian Peninsula as well as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, because Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is actually the last entity to successfully generate an attack against the United States back in 2009, the Christmas Day bomber. So we need to keep unrelenting pressure on them. In that area, Iran is not helpful at all. They fomented and began the war that now exists, the civil war that now exists in Yemen, that adds immense suffering to that part of the world, and it is a definite factor as we pursue operations against ISIS. So if I were to pull back and finish by just saying that the largest strategic view is we are close to finishing the physical heart of ISIS. AQ is similarly suppressed. It will require continual pressure to prevent them from resurging. They also have tentacles, though, that reach out into sub-Saharan Africa, as you noted, and in other parts of the world. And that's where the larger coalition of nations that have the same interests that we have in preventing the return of ISIS are going to be a critical factor as we go forward.
what's the latest on al-Baghdadi?
Sir, I think he's a very scared man running for his life somewhere in the desert near the Euphrates River.
And as obviously that's a major goal to get him as we try to continue to mop up the caliphate.
Senator, I would just note, as long as you're concerned about whether you're going to die in the next hour or so, it's hard to plot attacks against Detroit.
There you go. General Clark, tell me, since SOCOM is involved in all of these areas, sometimes you might have, even though you've gotten a lot of resources, SOCOM, over the years, you have to worry about getting stretched too thin. What can the Congress do to help you so that you're not getting too thin?
Senator, thanks for that question. I think critical for SOCOM, and a little bit to follow on with what General McKenzie just stated, SOCOM has to have the global view of the threat. In that role, looking at the flow of fighters, looking at the resources, and looking at the messaging that is going across COCOM boundaries. In order to have that, and to ensure that SOCOM is not stretched too thin, we've got to continue to get the sustained and predictable and adequate funding for the force and for our budget going forward.
And General McKenzie, do you see U.S. troops continuing to help you mop up ISIS and al-Qaeda, even in these areas that are contested like Yemen?
Senator, right now, and in Yemen in particular, we provide unique capabilities that get after al-Qaeda and AQ. In the long term, our view would be you want to create conditions where local security forces are going to be able to contain those threats. We are not at that level yet, but that remains our clear goal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. And we thank both of our witnesses for your patience, and also thank your families for being here to support you. And we are adjourned. Thank you. You bet. Well, let's go down and see what they're
Funding for some government agencies